them joining NATO now certainly is impossible while the war is going on, and that's the point that President Biden was making. That if NATO were to accept Ukraine now, every member of NATO would be at war. He's not ruling it out, and he's not ruling out a range of security guarantees, and that's why he mentioned the Israel model. But certainly a bespoke model will be offered for Ukraine at this summit. I'm not sure what it'll be just yet, but I think that it's pretty well fashioned between the NATO members already.
I wonder if the problem might be that wars sound like they're very binary things. There's either a war on or there's a war not on. But with something like Ukraine, they invaded Crimea in 2014. That lasted until the present day. You could imagine a situation that's still messy, where Russia is still in parts of Ukraine, where there might be a ceasefire, but not necessarily a settlement. That would suggest to me that, again, it's hard to see Ukraine becoming a full member, because there's never going to be a situation, is there not, where Russia is not threatening to such an extent that their membership could precipitate a war?
Well, exactly. That's a very good point. And that's precisely a second challenge that they would face, is how do you draw the boundaries? Now, some people have argued, well, we accepted Western Germany and not East Germany. It's not as simple as people might like to say. I think a related argument is that there are a number of NATO members that still have yet to meet their pledge commitments, or 2% commitments that they made many years ago to increase their defense spending, et cetera. And the burden really still falls on the United States. Over half of NATO spending is done by the United States. Now, it's not ideal for a number of reasons, not only because it's good to share the burden with NATO members, but there's a possibility that the U.S. could elect Donald Trump or a Donald Trump-like character in a year. And then where would NATO be? So they really do need to be thinking about ways that other members can distribute the pain, the effort much more evenly. It'll never be perfectly even. The U.S. will always contribute the bulk, but certainly other countries need to be thinking about how they can do more now. And
why is it not contingent on them meeting that 2% threshold, being a member of NATO? I mean, being a member of NATO gives you all sorts of benefits. The benefit, presumably, of not being attacked because you're a part of a large organization that would fight back. Is it not just as straightforward as a contingency thing? If you pay your 2% of GDP to defense, then you're in, and if you don't, you're not.
Yeah, well, that's not the way it was set up originally, and of course these pledges were made about 9 years ago. I think they're due to revisit them, but for a very long time the U.S. was shouldering the burden, and I think in many ways it didn't mind. It was during the Cold War. It made sense. It was a different environment. Things have changed. There aren't really penalties, and many countries argue all sorts of reasons why maybe development spending should be included or this should be included, and so it isn't clear cut. It isn't clear cut how you actually factor what that 2% is, but it's certainly the case that more NATO members need to be stepping up. And if they can't do it in an existential crisis like this, where a war in Europe is existential for most NATO members, it is slightly concerning if they'll be able to do it when the war ends.
Meanwhile, Sweden is set to join NATO. How much of this was Turkey having dropped its objections? How much of this just horse trading, that there were no real objections to Sweden joining, but Turkey just wanted something, and so they used it as a bargaining chip?
It's likely there were all sorts of horse trading activities going on behind the scenes. They did get to where they wanted to be. It's certainly important to keep Turkey in the fold as well. Interesting that Turkey's still interested in EU membership. And by the way, Ukraine getting into the EU would go some ways to meeting the conditions that NATO members have, such as democratic control of the armed forces, et cetera. So I think EU membership is also very important for Ukraine, just as it should be for Turkey, although I think that would be an interesting conversation.
So if Ukraine is in the EU, it's likely to be more acceptable to NATO. But we're still left with that problem that ultimately, if Ukraine is in peril of Russia, it's a big threat to NATO if they join. And if it's not in peril from Russia, then there's no great worry about them joining either way. So it feels to me that this is almost an impossible situation.
It is impossible, as you say, precisely because I think the argument you're making is it's in Russia's interest to keep some sort of low level dispute, even if there is a ceasefire,
Yeah.
so that they don't get into the EU, they don't get into NATO because of ongoing conflicts on their territory. And so that also will need to be resolved. It's incredibly challenging. There's no simple answer to it. I know that the US is committed right now, under President Biden's leadership at least, to supporting Ukraine and to providing as many security guarantees as they can to help Ukraine modernize its armed forces, to help Ukraine fight this war and end this war as soon as possible. But it's just, there aren't easy answers to this challenge.